So Anna is a former Supreme Court judge and Chancellor of Justice in Sweden. And as Monsignor said, she is the main force behind the Nordic model.
Yeah, I just need the
clicker.
Yeah. So may I have to ask the technicians again?
Well, luckily we have a little extra time today. Some of our Nigerian sisters are not presenting, so we will have more time for them, the rest of them, and more time for discussion, so don't get nervous.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I will give you a short, trying to give you a short description of what we call, and Monsignor said the Nordic model. I prefer to say the Swedish model, since there is one Nordic country that has not committed to this. Denmark is very strange and coming out of this. So I call it the Swedish model. I will, unfortunately, it's very difficult to do this in 15 minutes, but I have some pamphlets that I will give you later, so I can give you the possibility to read more for yourselves, and also I will give you the link, so some of you may not get the pamphlet, but you can then find it on the internet, more information. Well, some facts first about Sweden, since maybe not all of you know this small country in the north. It's one of 5 Nordic countries in the very north. Sweden is a member of the European Union. We have about 10 million inhabitants, so it's a small country. It's a liberal democracy, and worth noticing is that Sweden is a country that has not seen war since 1814. We are very lucky in that respect. And I also want to emphasize women were given the right to vote in 1921. If you look at prostitution in Sweden, Sweden was a very poor country only 100 years ago or 50 years ago. And if you look at prostitution in Sweden, you could say that in the years 1850 to 1980, women in prostitution in Sweden had to register. They had to undergo regular medical examinations. And all up till 1980, you could see women in prostitution were considered antisocial. They could be coerced into an institution, and this was the fact. We had a change in perspective which came with democracy, which came with economic growth, which came with the possibility to think about things in a different way, and we had a strong women's movement in Sweden after the vote was in 21. And after a while, we did get to the point where we say in Sweden, we say today, and we said like from, I would say, 1980s, that prostitution is considered unacceptable in a society based on gender equality. And gender equality is a very strong word in Sweden, which we emphasize. And this meant that we wanted to make a shift of focus from the person being exploited to the exploiter, the buyer. If I say prostitution, I think many of you, and I think almost all of you, the first picture you get is the person exploited, is the prostitute. And in Sweden, we wanted to change this, a shift of focus from the person being exploited to the exploiter, the buyer, who is really the root cause of prostitution. And the simple answer to this, and the simple fact is that if there was no demand, there would be no prostitution. The policy in Sweden has principles, and very short I could say, we find that prostitution is against gender equality. We find that prostitution is harmful, of course, to the individual, but it's also harmful to society. Prostitution is incompatible with international principles of human rights. Focus on demand is very important, since this is the root cause of prostitution. I can not say this many times enough. And it's also very important to note that prostitution and trafficking cannot be separated. You cannot say that, oh, I'm against trafficking, but prostitution is okay, because these are linked together very, very strongly, and you cannot separate them. And a very important fact also, which we have in recent years, like the last 20 years, seen more and more, is that prostitution and trafficking finances serious crime, international crime, and this is what is driving this all around the world. So in 1999, which is now 20 years ago, as the first country in the world, Sweden introduced a law that criminalizes the purchase of sex. And the person who is being used, if we use the old word, the prostitute, is considered a victim, and she, it's mostly a she, you know that, some men also, but the victim is considered a victim and is entitled to the help of society and is not in any way looked upon as bad. It's a person who is a victim in this. And the law has a gender equality as well as a human rights perspective. That's how we look upon it. After 10 years, in 2008, I was appointed, I was at that time Supreme Court judge, and I was appointed to lead an inquiry to look into what had happened in Sweden in 10 years after we made this legislation. And what we could find in measure was that we had a 50% reduction in the amount of street prostitution. That was easy to see. We had an increase of contacts via internet, but of course that was because in 1999 there was no internet. But we also looked at other countries close to Sweden, Norway and Denmark, and you could see that the increase in Sweden was much, much less. I don't have you can find the figures if you look on the internet, but it was much less in Sweden than in the neighboring countries. It's like 3 times as many in Denmark, Norway than in Sweden. The ban also had made it less profitable and thus less interesting to establish brothel operations in Sweden, which is a very important thing when it comes to these economic results. And we also could find that there was no increase of indoor prostitution. This was something that we had thought about and wondered about, if it would go underground. This is still people saying this, but that is not true. Prostitution in Sweden has not gone underground. If the buyer can find prostitution, so can the police. That is what the police say. So there is no increase of indoor prostitution. And thus, this ban had helped to keep down prostitution in Sweden. We do have prostitution in Sweden, but this is a way helping to reduce it. Also very important is the normative effect. That, I would say for myself, is almost the most important thing. We have a strong public support for the ban. When it was introduced as a law, some political parties on the right wing did not want this law. Today, and only after a few years, all political parties in Sweden are in favor of this law, and we have a strong public support, over 70%. At the same time, it's interesting to note that just a few years before the law was taken, people were against it. They were if they were asked in a survey, they would say, "Oh, that's a stupid idea. You couldn't ban buying sex." But very soon we changed this, and it's very interesting to note that in France, where this law, sort of a Swedish law, was taken in 2016. Only after a year you could find the same thing in France, where prostitution had been something that was very much accepted, but it just took a short time with people understanding this, that there was a public support also in France. We found in Sweden that this had a deterrent effect on sex buyers. Sweden is a country where we have, if you look in figures, a low percentage of men saying that they have bought sex. We had 13% when the law came into force, but after 10 years we found that the same figure was 8%. So even if we do have the problem that people would go abroad to buy sex, since all countries don't have the Swedish legislation, we still find that it has had a deterrent effect. And the very important thing is to note that there have been no negative effects for the persons exploited. The question was, would there be more violence? Would it be more, in any way, negative? The only negative effect, of course, is that there are fewer buyers. But that was sort of the idea of the law, so you couldn't say that's a negative effect. But no more violence, and you could compare this to Germany, which is a country that has prostitution free. You can be a pimp in Germany legally, and there you have many women in prostitution murdered. In Sweden, there has been no murder of anyone in prostitution since this law came into force 20 years ago. And the ban has discouraged establishment of organized crime, which is very, very important. We find that very important. And I will say that in 1999, when the law came into force, trafficking wasn't an issue. I don't know about your countries, but in Sweden at that time, trafficking really wasn't talked about. Of course, we had trafficked persons, but trafficking has become a big thing with all the people moving, with all the fugitives, and with the big economic interest there is in this. So to in any way try to stop the establishment of organized crime, I find this is a very, very important point with this legislation. So our conclusions were that the ban has had the intended effects, reducing the number of buyers and thus the number of exploited, making business less profitable for pimps and brothel owners. But of course, this is not, we could not sit down now and say, okay, we did it. We have to continue and work persistently with social work in order to help those who are in prostitution in Sweden today. And if you look at figures, the very, very vast majority of people used and exploited in prostitution in Sweden are not Swedish women and girls. They come from other countries. They come from the very, very poor countries in the Eastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria. They come from your countries. Nigeria is a country where many come from to Sweden. And Sweden is a country of, we take in this problem. And we, of course, want to try to help those who come and are exploited in this way. So we have to be very persistent and work very hard to try to stop this even more. The positive, direct, and normative effect of the legislation have inspired other countries, and I just have noticed that we have Ireland 2017, and as I said, France 2016, Canada, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, Norway, Iceland, South Africa, which I don't know very much about, but I'm happy to say, and South Korea. So this is going on, and the work is going on, but I'm sad to say that being in the UN this fall, it seems to me that there is a big lobby who is working in order to try to make it sex work, which to me is just something that is not true. I mean, it is not true that this is a work that anyone would choose freely if they had another choice. So it's sad that the UN still is a bastion to try to win. But in Europe, we have been doing some good things, and the European Parliament passed, it's a non-binding, but it's a resolution urging the countries in the EU to work against prostitution by focusing on demand, which is the Swedish model. And Mr. Mendes Bota, who unfortunately cannot be here today, but I really want to emphasize that he did a very, very important thing when he, as a rapporteur for the European Council, made a report called Prostitution and Trafficking. And in this he says that prostitution and trafficking are distinct phenomena, but there is a very clear and strong link between them. And he also says that voluntary prostitution is a myth. He went all over Europe, and he says voluntary prostitution is a myth. And he says that variety of measures should be taken, but of course he emphasizes that he thinks the Swedish model so far would be the best way to try to curb prostitution. And sadly enough, of course, today, especially with all the refugees, we have children and women being trafficked and exploited in prostitution, and the numbers are so immense that you cannot really say them. But I want to emphasize once again that if there was no demand, there would be no prostitution. And I think this is something that we should remember, and therefore, even if the criminalization is not really, it's not the whole answer, it's a way of making a norm that says that no one can buy another person's body. And we have to stop this, which is called modern slavery, rightly is called modern slavery. Can I have some more minutes for a short, just follow up, okay? Because then I would like to say that let's see where I have my notes. I just want to say today that it is a bit of a dark day today. I don't know if you've seen it, but it seems that Brexit is coming through. The British are leaving the European Union, which of course is very, very bad. In Madrid, Poland is stepping out. They do not want to stop the global warming. And we have President Trump, I say no more. The Paris Agreement, okay. So all this makes me sad and wondering. But at the same time, I just want to say, and that's why I want to say that I'm so proud to be able to be here with you. You are such a force, and the work you are doing in your countries, African countries, is wonderful, and it's inspiring to see you. And we all know, and it has been said before, no one can do this alone, but we must not lose hope. And therefore, I will take a minute, although I don't have any more minutes, to say that the last minute before dawn is the darkest moment. But today in Sweden, on the 13th of December, we all celebrate this saint, Sancta Lucia, yes? And so this morning in Sweden, women, girls, and boys go and sing to each other in order to say that today is a very dark day, but it doesn't take long until we have the light coming back. So I would like to sing, just like Sister did before, and sing to you what is sung in Sweden today this morning. Right. Now you can imagine me being standing here in a white gown, and I have a crown on my head which is green with lights on it, so it's candles, candlelight. And then we come in and we sing. Natten går tunga fjäll runt gård och stuva kring jord som sol förgät skuggorna ruva. Då i vårt mörka hus stiger med tända ljus Santa Lucia, Santa Lucia. Då i vårt mörka hus stiger med tända ljus Santa Lucia, Santa Lucia. Thank you, all my sisters.
As this morning we have a little more time, I think it's important to open a discussion about this very interesting paper. So if you have something to ask to Anna, and this could be important. And after we go to the conference of Sister Bonetti. So, please. No, but you try.
Thank you very much. Sorry? Okay. Thank you very much for that presentation on the Swedish model. It's a very interesting model. And much as I agree with you that that is the way to go, I'm thinking about the lived reality in our countries, particularly the African countries, where, unlike Sweden, we don't have proper social support for our people. And therefore, many women engage in prostitution because that's the only way they can be able to support themselves. They have been pushed into that situation. And there is no other way that the government is not coming in to help them. So you tell them, don't do that. This should not be a way of supporting yourself, but you are not giving them an alternative. So I don't know, what you think about how this can work in places like Africa where we do not have social support.
Thank you. Anna?
I'm fully aware of this. Of course, it's very, very different in many of your countries. But I would say that talking about it and just thinking about how to change your way of looking at it could, in time, make in your countries also this being a reality. Because, I think we all here, we can agree that, of course, this is not, it's not human rights for a woman to have to choose this. But, so I think that maybe just informing, talking about it, and slowly making society change, because that is what happened in Sweden. And I'm well aware that you cannot sort of just take this on, but the important thing for you, I would say, is to make people start to think in the other direction and understand that it's not, this is, first of all, it's grave criminality, which is important for politicians. They should be interested in this, since this drives grave criminality in your countries also. And then you could try to find a way of understanding that women are also human beings and women should be treated like human beings, which they are not when prostitution is the only solution. But I'm well aware that, of course, your situation is very different.
Mina, then Blessing, next. Mina, and then Blessing.
Merci. Merci, le juge Anna, pour votre extraordinaire présentation. On est très positif et optimiste avec votre exemple de la Suède. En fait, il est lié à une forme de la traite, qui est la prostitution. Et c'est un bon exemple pour le répéter pour d'autres formes de la traite, qui est la mendicité, qui est la plantation des organes, qui est l'immigration illégale. Mais, comme a dit notre sœur de Kenya, il y a aussi comment combattre la pauvreté et la vulnérabilité. Ce n'est pas évident. Comme vous avez dit, les femmes victimes de la prostitution en Suède, ce ne sont pas des Suédoises, ce sont des femmes étrangères qui sont la plupart du pays du Nigeria. En fait, mais en général, je suis très optimiste par cet exemple que j'aimerais bien porter à mon pays parce que nous aussi au Maroc, on lutte contre la prostitution, mais il y a d'autres réseaux qui luttent, qui veulent bien que cette prostitution continue. Ils disent que c'est la liberté, que c'est les libertés individuelles, on ne peut pas refuser, interdire aux gens de profiter de leur corps librement. Voilà, je vous remercie pour ça et c'est un bon exemple. Merci.
Yes.
Yes.
And after Blessing, then Priscilla, and then Rose, and then Elmi. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
No, mixture. Yeah, okay. Yes, and we had yesterday some talk about this, that, my point of view is that the economic situation, poverty, is it drives this. Poverty and war drives this, of course. There are also other things, but these are the facts that make people choose this. But if you ask those who are in prostitution, of course, they would all say they would like something else to do. So this idea about voluntary prostitution is a myth. I agree with Mr. Bota on that.
Look, this was exactly the same problem in France. You know that when in France decide to put this law, that is in analogy completely of the Sweden model, was a great reaction, of course, by the traffickers, but also by the women, victims, in favor of conserving the prostitution. But was Holland, and not a special example of virtue, but understand that this exactly against to the idea of the French Revolution, égalité, fraternité. So they put this and accept it, and today it's very important. So I think that we need to really to do something very strong, a sort of revolution about the rights of the body. Thank you.
Okay, so Blessing, then Priscilla, then Rose.
Okay, thank you so much for that powerful presentation, and I also want to thank the work of the Swedish government for passing such a law to criminalize the purchase of horses. But the question that I want to ask is this. Because in Italy, when the legislation was passed last year on security and protection, which make many of the girls victims, many of the immigrants to lose their permit to stay on humanitarian purpose, we discovered that most of these victims, they no longer walk on the street again because not having documents, they were afraid that they may risk deportation. Then we discovered that there was an increase in indoor prostitution. And the Nigerians normally call this indoor prostitution connection house. There was a lot of connection house. Even as I'm speaking right now, there is a lot of connection houses owned by Nigerians where the girls are made to prostitutes. Now there is increase also in internet prostitution, online prostitution, there is increase on it. Then my question is this, passing this law, how do you people address the indoor prostitution and internet online prostitution? Thank you.
I can say that, as I said, I mean, we haven't solved this problem, but we find that we have solutions. And one solution, of course, is that we have to give the police and authorities, to give them the strength to work with this. This has been a big battle in Sweden. I mean, the police have many things to do, and this could not be, this wasn't highest on their agenda. So we're still striving to get it highest. And I think it's important there also to understand that this is not only, if I say only with quotes, only human beings being mistreated. This is something which is making big criminals gain. So what happens is, if you don't look for this, you don't see it. If you don't look for indoor prostitution, you don't see it. But it is possible to see it if the police, if authorities, social authorities are looking for it. So you have to give it time, and you have to have measures and ways to work with it. But you have to be consistent, and you have to be persistent in order to stop this. And I agree with you, what you see is true, of course. Although I think we are in Sweden less, we have less of it than in the rest of Europe.
Thank you. Priscilla, then Rose, then Elmi.
Thank you very much. I give an applaud to Sweden for the step that they took towards abolishing or criminalizing the prostitution. And then the point that I would like to make is the fact that if we encourage countries to criminalize prostitution, it is going to help, because look at what Sweden has done. It has reduced it. And I can bet that it will work, because in Botswana, Prostitution is a criminal offense for starters, and two, there is criminalization of establishing brothels, because where prostitution is legal, then the establishments of brothels are legal, and therefore this is where trafficking is at its highest because of the legality of prostitution. So where it is criminalized, then we will see minute of it, because at least it will be much better, we can monitor it. So the problem is if it is not criminalized, then the eradication or the control of women trafficking for sexual exploitation is going to be very difficult. So best we start with the criminalization of prostitution where it is not criminalized.
I think you're quite right, and I agree with you very, very much. But it's also, I also just want to emphasize that if you say criminalize prostitution, it's very easy to think that this would be the vulnerable person, the exploited person who is criminalized. And I think you are aware of the fact that still today in our world, the figure I have, I don't know if it's true, but the figure I have is that 100 countries around the world still criminalize the victim. The prostitute, the person who is used, who is exploited, is criminalized. So you have to make a difference between these two. And maybe some of you know that Amnesty International, an organization that I respected, they made a stand on this, saying that we should decriminalize prostitution. They cannot think two things at the same time. You have to criminalize the person who is driving this, the buyer, but of course you have to decriminalize the person who is used. But this is also very important just to have this in your head, to know this.
Okay, Rose, then Elmi.
Yeah, thank you very much. May I join my fellow sisters to laud what Sweden has done. And it is a way of recognizing the dignity of a woman. Because I have been a career judicial officer, and I was saddened when the police carry out swoops. They come across, they arrest people from the brothels, the partners, and who is brought to court is the woman and not the man. So the focus should be the other side with the higher penalties. And for Brexit, don't mourn over it. That is the current political wave. Take an example from the East African community. We broke it. We said we go our own way. But we reached a point and said, no, we need one another. So that is the political wave currently. It will change, and it will change with you. Go back home, speak against it, and say, we need to start together. Thank you.
Thank you. One last question, and then we'll discuss more. We have another discussion time after our speakers this morning. Elmi.
So just two comments. The first comment that was made after your talk around the low socioeconomic groups and the lack of public support and the difficulty in prosecuting people in that sort of situation or criminalizing victims. I think it's just very important to note that these organized crimes doesn't make people's lives better. It's the same thing when you look at people who supply organs, and they usually go into this with the idea that they're going to make either their own lives or their families' lives better by getting some money back into their system. And if we look at the long-term outcomes of these people, their lives don't improve. So I think we mustn't be under the impression that we are going to make people's lives worse if we start cutting down on things like prosecution. These people it's not a solution, and we can't see it as a form of a solution. But my second question is to you, Anna. You are making a very good case to stop the demand and to use that in order to stop the trafficking. Now, in organ transplantation, that means stopping the patients who want to get organs. And we've had a lot of discussion around this. How do we stop this demand? Of course, if you have more organs, it's wonderful. But if in the current situation, how do you stop this? And I would like to have your view on whether there is a place for stopping demand by stopping patients from obtaining organs from trafficked victims.
Of course, this is a very difficult question, and we had yesterday the discussion of who should be criminalized when it comes to organ donation. I would say that really, I mean, the crook here is not the person wanting an organ who is, of course, in a way a victim, but it's the organization that is making money out of this. But at the same time, you could say, of course, which I understand if it was myself or it was my family, it's a difficult thing to say, no, I should not take an organ that is taken in the wrong way. But isn't it a fact that we have to discuss this, we have to think about it, and we have to talk about human rights? It's not, I mean, I wouldn't say you could feel very good. It wasn't good for you to have a liver from someone who died because of what you were given. But of course, it's a complicated thing. But really, you have to go after those who make the money, and that's not, of course, it's rich people wanting organs, but in the end, it's the higher up in the hierarchy. But of course, I have no answer to you.
Of course, that relates to trafficking for labor as well, where you are not going to get rid of the demand, for sure.